A very good evening. Welcome to The Bottom Line, a wrap of the business news of the day. And tonight we're looking at a deal that will benefit 55 countries and more than 1 billion people. It is the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement. South Africa has, of course, signed. It was officially launched by the African Union in Niger earlier this month. The problem is that African countries right now don't trade that much with one another. About 16% of Africa's overall trade is amongst Africans themselves. Now compare that to nearly 70% for a bloc like the European Union. So the free trade area is aimed at bringing down barriers to trade, such as import tariffs. The idea is that African countries and companies will sell more and invest more on this continent, and everyone could get richer. Africa will also be more independent. Instead of relying on global trading partners, we will all be relying on our neighbors. Now, I was going to bring up a timeline. Let's just run through it very quickly. In March 2018, the Free Trade Area Agreement was signed by 44 states. South Africa and Nigeria initially held back. In July last year, South Africa joined the party. In April of this year, there was the required number of members ratifying the deal to make it viable, and it was officially launched in July. The African Continental Free Trade Area is now the largest trade area in the world, but not much free trade happening yet. This is the dream of many leaders to uplift the continent, and there are timelines in place set to become operational mid-2020, with the phasing out of levies on about 10% of goods and services. Ultimately, inter-regional African trade could grow by more than 50%. Well, to discuss, we're joined by Professor Rajen Pillay, the CEO of Garuda Capital. That's a mergers and acquisitions firm based in Sandton in Johannesburg. Thank you very much for being with us,
Good evening, Francis.
Professor Rajen. So is this going to happen, first of all? It's not going to stay a paper deal, basically.
I certainly think it will happen, but it's going to take a bit of time to actually manifest itself on the ground for people to see changes. You must remember the European Union took more like 17 years to happen.
Sure.
So these things take a long time.
So when we're talking about 2020, is that a pipe dream, actually?
It's a little bit on the short end, a little bit quick, so probably another 10 years after that.
Sure. The question here is, if African trade, intra-African trade, is so beneficial and so lucrative, why isn't more happening already? I mean, the saying is capital goes where the money is.
Correct. But unfortunately, Africa has probably got a long history of colonization. So South Africa, for example, never traded with the rest of Africa. It was a foreign part. We didn't regard ourselves as being part of the African continent.
Yeah.
So we put up barriers, we isolated ourselves, etc. Then, of course, there's Francophone Africa, and there's various regional blocks and trading blocks. So it's a question now of integration. Previously, it was bilateral relations, country to country, then country in regions, and now in blocks. So that's why that's what we're needing to actually get past now.
So I was in Cote d'Ivoire, and they were talking about this at a conference, that the English countries sort of hop over the Francophone countries.
Absolutely.
For trade.
Yes.
You see Total operating in some countries, not in others.
Precisely.
How do you deal with that language barrier first, the English and French?
Language barrier is always going to be there. It's a question of integrating, but it probably comes from the English and French problem. The English are right across the channel and they don't want to speak French. The French are right across the channel and don't want to speak English. And unfortunately, Africa has been colonized. So we have these blocks: French Africa, English Africa, Portuguese Africa, for example.
Yeah.
So the language is going to be a problem, but with the 55 states coming together, at least now we have some kind of political agreement. At least at the very high level, we have a political agreement that Africa should be one kind of trading area. Now it's a matter of each individual country designing what suits itself in terms of customs, loss of revenues, sovereignty issues, etc. So these are the things that are going to be starting to be dealt with practically.
Well, always in situations like these, it's said the big countries can benefit, the smaller countries can lose out because they don't get that revenue from imports coming in.
Precisely.
Are there mechanisms ready to protect those smaller countries?
Well, there aren't mechanisms already, and it's typical in the world, and in particular with this free trade agreement, it's also going to be, the big issue is who's going to be driving it, who's going to be the bully boy. Is it going to be Nigeria or is it going to be South Africa? And that's typically the things that are felt, not necessarily discussed, but it's got to do with powers of influence, powers of center, powers of manufacturing base, and national influence.
Yeah. So say I think Paul Kagame of Rwanda is talking about a 0.2% tariff. So not zero.
Yeah.
Say that's implemented. So you mean you need someone to police that actually?
Yep, absolutely.
Wouldn't that be the AU? But then do we need a stronger AU?
Well, certainly we need a strong AU, because you must remember the AU came out of the OAU, the Organization of African Unity, which started in 1962, didn't go very far. In 2002, the African Unity was formed, African Union was formed, and out of that, this is now a flagship project of the African Union. So it's a big project, it's getting a lot of attention, and politically I think there's quite a bit of buy-in. But of course, it's now got to do with borders, dropping borders, allowing free trade, and all the practical stuff to happen.
And what about movement of people?
Well,
because it seems unfair. So companies can move across borders.
Very much so.
People generally can't. What are we talking about as Africa?
Well, it's going to be a very topical and very heated kind of debate, especially if we look at South Africa and our borders, and north of our borders, for example. So we might want to welcome the free trade, but I'm not sure we, at the European Union stage yet, we want to actually allow completely free travel.
Yeah.
Because that's going to put a lot of burden, a lot of pressure on the state, on different countries, for example. And you'll find that there'll be a mass movement of people towards the more industrialized areas, putting pressure on those centers.
Which we're sort of seeing already.
Which we're seeing already, yeah.
I'm glad you've raised this issue of there are hurdles, and I mean right now, so yes, African states want to work together, but there's also competition. So we wanted to be the gateway into Africa, but Mauritius is doing so well, and they're cutting their taxes, and there's this fear, a race to the bottom. I mean, can't it become very much a race to the bottom if everyone starts cutting taxes, cutting tariffs, etc.?
Unfortunately, South Africa, we're not in such a fortunate position to be able to cut taxes. Our economy is not really strong enough currently, so some people might argue that you should go into a free trade agreement when your economy is pretty strong, you're pretty buoyant, and you're pretty well off, basically. Unfortunately for South Africa, our economy has been distressed for the last 10 years. There's been very, very little investment in this formal economy. There's little to no job creation. And if suddenly we have large numbers of people coming in, then the xenophobic attacks become reality all over again.
Okay, very quickly. So you say 10 years to get there, but should South Africa be wanting this? Is it good for us and good for our businesses?
The theory behind free trade areas is that it's very good for business. It's conducive to business. And ultimately, the European Commission expects that by 2022, if the African Free Trade Area happens, there'll be an increase of pan-African trade of at least 50%. Now, that's a big increase in trade.
And is that realistic?
In my reckoning, perhaps a little bit premature, but possible.
All right. So it's exciting, but we're talking about 2020. Rajen Pillay saying that's maybe too soon. Maybe we're looking at 10 years before this free trade area we have signed, but before it really becomes a reality and starts uplifting countries, including South Africa on the continent. Rajen Pillay, professor from Garuda Capital. He's the CEO there.